Bonsoir.
Hello everyone. You chose a very good panel. We're going to talk about CSR. You'll be able to ask your questions. I will ask you please to take your seats and to lower your voices so we can hear each other out. CSR, from mirage to reality. This is quite a big question, and it concerns the company's transformation. We need to change our productive model. The decade to come has challenges, holds a lot of challenges, and companies are at the heart of these transformations. The state will have to play its part, and the various regulators also, but it is a real responsibility for companies. CSR, social, environmental. Social takes more and more importance, and in social, I would say that S stands for sens, which is meaning in French, and that means a lot more to the young generation. There's an urgency, climate urgency, and it's a long-term urgency. How does a company deal with this urgency, this long-term urgency? That's what we're going to be talking about it for these next 50 minutes. I will present to you our speakers. First of all, Marie-Françoise Renard, who's the economist invited by the Circle of the Economists. She will moderate our discussion, and she will add a few scientific references on this topic. You are specializing in international trade, China and Asia. You told me that CSR is something, it's a concept that was not so foreign to the Chinese world. It is interesting to see that these questions are not only European questions. I can see among the first questions that came up on the chat box, there's a question on international trade, and we'll get back to this with you. I would like to introduce you the various panelists. Thierry Martel, who's general manager of Groupama Insurance. Groupama is a major player, 30,000 employees, 36 billion turnover, major player in the insurance, and it's an insurer is a company that has sensors on how the society evolves, and also how the risk scenario evolves. So we'll be very excited to hear you out. Arnaud Gangloff, you're CEO and senior partner of the Kia Group. It's a group specialized on transformation of companies, how today we put companies on the right path for a sustainable world, and we see that there's a need to help the companies that are at a loss with all the changes happening. So you have the outlook of an accelerator, of a guide, maybe. You operate on many sectors which are at the heart of this issue. Next to you, you have Hadi Medeb. We are going to change continent. We're going to get closer to Africa and to Tunisia, and we're going to look at the Tunisian example. You have a wide experience in finance, engineering, industry, and you are also heading the Financial Center for Entrepreneurs, which is a microfinance institution, and you take this issue of transformation at heart in countries of the South where challenges are many, in a continent that will be also at the heart of this transformation. So we would like to expand our spectrum, our focal points, by watching with you how this dimension is being carried in a country that is close to us, that we think about often, that is fighting with a lot of difficulties. And next to you, there's Axel Lebert. We're very happy to meet her again. I wouldn't say that we lost sight of her, but we've seen you a lot for a while, and you were former Secretary of State for Digital Economy and Innovation. You were responsible for a large part for the French Tech, and you also support all these transformations, inclusion, digital, and how technologies are going to play a role in the debate that we'll be having. What role does technology play? Surely it can do everything, but we can't do without technology. So this is probably something that you will enlighten us on. You left the responsibility for the Red Cross, and now you're going to be in charge of CSR. We can't disclose where, but it shows your commitment. So I would now give the floor to Marie-Françoise Renard, who will give us the landscape for our session, and you will also have a chance to ask your questions in the room, and or for those of you who follow us from distance on the chat box. We hope to take as many questions as possible. Each of you will have 4 or 5 minutes to talk about your topic, and then we'll have the roundtable going. Thank you, Vincent. The necessity of growth compatible with sustainable development is present every day, whether it's on environmental issues, social issues, ethical issues. All the actors of society have realized of the urgency of the change. And that's why we have implemented the concept of societal responsibility of the company that formalizes the central role of it in the process. CSR, as we know, is part of a voluntary approach of the company, so its implementation is not guaranteed. But despite the skepticism of some people, particularly on the environmental side, CSR has become a challenge a challenge of performance for companies. Is it a mirage or is it a reality is the question that we have to answer. Is it really a change of paradigm or is just hot air? So the values of society are changing, and that leads to the emergence of new standards. CSR and the methods to implement it and the choice to assess it remain very vague. Companies are referring to the SDGs to define or goals defined by many forms. The one that is the more recognized is the norm ISO 26000, but there's a doubt between the legitimacy of the approach and the cost of some measures. There's a big risk that CSR will remain a mirage. However, there's some big pressures that could allow us to scale it up. First of all, competition leads big companies to communicate more on their good practices and to worry about their reputation. Second, civil society, particularly with through the institutions, weigh on companies, on their environmental choices, but also for their human rights policy, with some concerns that are relative to the working conditions in countries that are supplying a number of goods. Third, a number of SMEs have to comply with the standards that are being imposed to them as supplier of big companies or as third-party suppliers. They can also be submitted to the pressure of the investors who don't want to risk to give money to companies that would be at risk in the middle term, particularly for their environmental risk. So they wouldn't lend money to companies that would not strongly mobilize on the CSR front. Fourth, within the companies themselves, there are some communities that have been created, communities of employees, but also some committees of managers to support the implementation of the principles of CSR within companies. Many areas of gray remain and block the implementation of CSR sometimes. First of all, the multiplication of references and labels make the information cost very high for companies. To this cost, we must add the cost of managing all this information. The management of the competition and prices has published recently a survey on eco-washing by saying a fourth of companies that were surveyed made some declarations that were wrong and contrary to the law. So there's a problem of information that is quite costly. Also, the assessments that are made are still very vague. Some companies are complaining to have some results that don't go with enough information, so they require some clarifications. And also, we must note that Europe is insufficiently present in these assessments that are still made by American scoring agencies. So despite an awareness and an evolution in the practices to be more efficient and maybe more realistic, the implementation of CSR should in the future be easier on an administrative point of view and be based on clear standards, maybe be more binding, which would imply that there's some good assessments being carried out and that these assessments could standardize a European definition. So the future of CSR is based on the capacity of mobilize the actors and mobilizing the companies on the various goals, CSR goals, whether they are environmental, societal, or ethical. Some capacities of adaptation of their organizations and capacities of cooperation. Because as long as we just stick to declarations, we are going to have very slow progress. I will stop here to give the floor to the other speakers. I'm going to give the floor now to Thierry Martel. And I would like to continue on what Marie-Françoise Renard told us. This is the first time that you're heading an insurance company where you manage the risks. There's a number of sensors that allow us to understand if we're still in the mirage phase or if it's becoming a reality. But based on what Marie-Françoise Renard said, there's some sectors that could act as facilitators, accelerators. Is the insurance sector that produces standards in its own way, incentives? Could it also encourage companies to go faster and to go further in their CSR approach and make sure that CSR becomes a part of their business model? Because it will be more advantageous for them to fully commit. Thank you for this question, and hello, everyone. The theme of this roundtable is CSR from mirage to reality. That means that the question is being raised and there's a gap between what we'd like to have and what we have. Insurers, we're in a particular situation because the carbon consumption from our activities is very low. It represents 10%. And those that we carry the responsibility for are the operations. We produce very little. It's the cars of our sales reps. So we absorb much more carbon than we produce. So the question here is not so much about what do we produce in terms of carbon, but how do we influence the production of carbon of others? And that raises a question in our investment policies and in our risk coverage. Reconstruction techniques and prevention techniques, because the damage that consumes the less carbon is the damage that doesn't happen. So I would like to shed a light on the difference between will and reality. The first problem is the legitimacy. What legitimacy do we have as insurers to put forward our convictions on law in the name of a general interest that would be the guarantee? So what would we refuse to insure them because we don't like their choices? And to replace the insurance of hydrocarbon tanks because we don't like it, because we don't agree with it. We can, of course, disagree to insure a tank of hydrocarbon if it's next to a river, if they don't have a retention system. But I used to say that the problems of today are the consequence of the solutions that we brought to yesterday's problem. Yesterday we could eat well, and yes.
What legitimacy do we have today to solve these problems? Because if our cows are producing methane, is it up to us to arbitrate between the methane from the cows and the milk we give our children? This is a real question. The second spotlight I'd like to give concerns the costs, because if we rebuild clean, this is much more expensive than building back exactly the same. And here again, in a competitive business model, the insured people who are very attentive to their price will choose the insurance company, they will always choose the cheapest premium. How do we install a clean green model in a completely competitive market? The third subject is the subject of availability. Let me take the example of automobile repairs. So 12% of the parts we put on the cars are recycled parts. At 12%, we're up to the right level. We're not able to obtain more than 12% of recycled parts. It's not a question of what we want to do, it's a question of what is possible. The fourth point I'd like to mention is the business model. And here I come back to the area of prevention. Prevention is very good. It prevents us from producing carbon. It's more comfortable for people because it's better not to be ill or to have an accident than to have a medical treatment or have a repair of your house. Often the prevention costs more money than the loss. In terms of damages and personal insurance, there's no economic studying say that prevention costs less than the loss. It's often the opposite. It's not easy to understand. Even in terms of public health, prevention is more expensive than the actual loss. Secondly, prevention cannot be mutualized. The principle of insurance is we're all exposed to risks. We don't know who's going to have the accident. Everybody pays for everybody else. Prevention is not mutualized. Prevention is individualized. So if we're trying to build a mutualized model based on this is very difficult. So the other thing about prevention, it is not very well accepted. It's not accepted very well because it's felt to be too restrictive, too intrusive. Let me take an example. This is a figure that is the life expectancy in good health in France. Yes, we live a long time in France. We live 84 years, but you live in good health for 62 years. Not a very good life expectancy in good health. So you live for a long time in bad health in France because our public health prevention policies in France are not very well developed. These are things you need to bear in mind that we could come back to. One of the reasons why we're not making progress in prevention in the healthcare is that for personal responsibility institutes, we can find an agreement with the state. For the health, it's the social security imposes an accountancy-based approach where we can't find an agreement. Then there's the taxation. Insurance today is taxed very heavily. Concerning reuse, we pay VAT twice and we pay 10% if you do prevention in healthcare. It's taxed at 15%. We have a very punitive taxation on the question of prevention. So how do we get out of this situation? Maybe we'll see when we answer the questions. There are rules of good conduct in the different sectors to find solutions for prevention and accept a consulting role for insurance. I think the 20th century has been the century of efficiency. The 21st century has to be the century of efficacy. We can see from what you've said, Thierry Martel, that society will have a role to play because all of the dilemmas you've mentioned, they can only be solved if society changes itself in its aspirations and the way it manages its risks and what it puts as a priority. There's a big problem in the south. We talk a lot about decarbonization of the north. There's a big problem of decarbonization of the south. We all have to move forward at the same time. Axel Lemaire, it's up to you. Over to you now. We're noting another aspect of this subject. We talked a lot about innovation. You're you're interested in transformation. You have expertise in this area. You've worked at CSR. We're curious to see how you're going to combine innovation, technology, and effectiveness of CSR. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about this subject, which is the building block for all of the others, in fact. In reality, in all of the roundtables, people are talking about the societal and environmental role of companies. When we ask if it's a mirage or reality, the answer is it's a utopia that we need to pursue, but it is a reality. And if I say that today, I wouldn't have said that a few years ago. This reality has changed very quickly. It's a reality in people's consciousness and in science and internally in business life. In people's consciousness, because the pandemic has made us aware very quickly, very violently, of the finite aspect of human existence, and that has played a role in the acceleration of accepting the principles of CSR. Also, thanks to science, our capacity to carry out modeling of climate change has become much more effective than before. The concept of planetary limits is a very recent concept. 15 years ago, that didn't exist. Today, we are able to develop models which apparently do not correspond to reality of climate change, which is taking place more quickly than the scientific models. But nevertheless, it is thanks to technology and to science that today we know we are really able to have a full awareness on an empirical basis of the full impact of climate change. And also rather a later realization by our decision makers in the political sphere and the economic sphere. I was a member of the government in 2015 during the COP21, and I can assure you that apart from the declarations of principle, there wasn't much commitment to action and transformation by the leaders of major companies. Today, this has changed, and it's changed very quickly, and now there's an increasing awareness amongst the younger generation. Thank you so much to the younger generations, how brave they are, who expose themselves and do something that nobody else is doing. Instead of them, they are representing the lobby for the future. We talk about the future generations, and they are doing that because I can tell you here again from observing them and working with them, nobody else can do it for them. So that's the societal reality, and a reality in business. We can see a whole panoply of tools that have been developed and that are used by dedicated CSR teams. When we talk about carbon balance, the materiality matrix, the analysis of the life cycle of products, and the analysis of the social life cycle, the different labels, the Scope 1 and Scope 3 impact assessments, and the circular economy analysis, all of these opportunities to transform. We're at a historic time because we're changing from a posture of risk prevention. CSR was a subject because of regulatory compliance. You had to meet the standards. It was a business challenge and a strategic challenge. And we can see this in the positioning of the business leaders within the different companies, with very real success stories. For example, to take account of a method very specific to CSR and sustainable development objectives, which is the idea of stakeholders, the idea we can't take decisions alone, so we have to get everybody around the table in the sphere of influence of the company, including employees and suppliers and consumers, etc., to decide upon the CSR strategy. There are stumbling blocks. You've heard about greenwashing and social washing. Today, I prefer the impression of greenwashing when I see an advert saying buy a green car, when you know that SUV weighs 1.6 ton. I don't believe in the green car, and the GSCF is not a reality either. We see the increase in litigation, 82 items of litigation taken against multinational companies. The government that has been found guilty of inaction in the environmental field, and this leads to something which is called green washing. I don't know if you know that phrase. Today, enterprises are afraid to not tell the truth about their environmental action. Maybe they think it's better to say nothing and to be silent. This CSR opportunity is an opportunity to be true and tell the truth and to be sincere, to say that we're all on the same path of transformation. This is the aim of the Sustainable Development Objectives, to give objectives, to give goals. I'll end what I have to say by saying once we've got past these stumbling blocks, what else is missing? The CSR has to become a societal objective for sustainable development. That's not the case at the moment when we see that today, this week, we've had the four hottest days in the world. And the European Commission will duplicate by 2 the reduction in carbon emissions in Europe in order to achieve its objective by 2030, to reduce by 55%. We're not at all in a good position in that area. So what do we need to do? We need to have more social action, because in CSR, the social aspect is very important. we are more and more familiar with the social impact of climate change. In concrete terms, poor people are paying a price, even though they're not responsible. What I'm saying is not polemical, it's proven. And it's a fact. And also, the social aspect is important as well, because we know the investment necessary to support economic players in their transformation to more sustainable business model will certainly have a social cost as well. The Pesani-Ferry report highlighted that. It measured this cost. And so, yes, we're talking about public money and private investment as well. And so this is an important subject. We're talking about CSR that is scaling up to become part of a sustainable, collective sustainable development. I've talked about the social aspect. I've talked about the need for investment in these subjects to support transition. I'd like to end quickly on data and technologies, because all of this can only become a reality with digital technology, data to carry out mapping, data to measure the time, data that enables us to understand where we are. It is absolutely key. And we have to ask the right questions. What is this technology for? What is ChatGPT, for example? It could be very useful, but not all the time. You know, we have this latency between the time when you ask the question and the time when ChatGPT gives the answer. It takes up a lot of energy. Perhaps sometimes we could use an Excel spreadsheet or a search engine. The whole issue to do with use of technology to accelerate ecological transition will be a question of using the right technology at the right time for the right type of use. Okay, there we have a very detailed roadmap. Arnaud Mongloff, you are the CEO and senior partner of CARE, which is a consulting body helping companies transform themselves. We can say that CSR is a central part of business life, and in relation to competitiveness, when companies behave properly and when they have solutions for decarbonization and for environmental protection, this has an impact, and it gives them the possibility to win contracts. So there's an incremental effect, I would say. There's a real effect that means that now starting to become a reality for you in the areas you observe, where you help companies. Can you also see this process taking place? We are changing here from a mirage to reality that is concrete and transformative. We have a slight problem with the mic. You need to press a button. Well, yeah, for technology, all you need to sort out technology is just press the right button. Yes, you have to press the right button. Yes, I think there's an accelerating effect. I work for a consulting company, and what we do every day is to work on responsible transformation to help our customers. More than 20% of our missions are directly dedicated to contributing to responsible transformation. This percentage is increasing every year. So one of the leading French companies in this area, because as an influencer, we wanted to, in this societal and economic world, we wanted to play this role. I agree with the optimistic approach. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of activity, and for all of our customers that we work with, they've taken a lot of initiatives, a lot of effervescence, and I can see a lot of acceleration that we've just been hearing about. And we feel that. You can see that for ourselves. I think the important subject is scaling up. How do we move from all of these examples and wonderful stories? How do we move up to an increase of scale? I'd like to emphasize 2 points here. We have to have a collective vision of value. What do we mean by value? And if we have a certain, stay with the old version of value, we won't make progress. The other point is a relation with action. And when talking about transition, you have to have a clear method. Axel put a document in the documentation for the rencontre to change from hope that is not disappointed. I think this idea of action is very important, and it inspired me. I'd like to come back to this idea of value. I think we all agree the extractive business models are in the past. We can't keep those. I think the trouble is that out of the vision of performance and economic and financial performance is focused on these extractive economic models. This is a paradigm that we have to be able to change. At IKEA, we're trying to get our customers to think of reduction and about reduction, reuse, recycling, about regeneration, to be able to reconnect to the living world. What I'm saying is there's a lot of innovation to find in this area of regeneration, and it's very important to change our business models if we want to scale up. The important thing is to have this capacity to realign the interests of the different stakeholders. I can talk in detail. For example, imagine you're a manufacturer of industrial washing machines. Your business is sell washing machines or to deliver clean laundry. If you're selling clean laundry, you no longer have to have programmed obsolescence because you want your machines to last as long as possible. You don't want to have use lots of water and lots of detergent to get the machines to run, because it'll integrate your margins and your costs. You'll be able to maximize your margins. So for the producer, that's good. For the customer, it's good because they're paying the fair price to satisfy their need, which is to have clean laundry. And the good news is that this is intelligent and useful for the environment as well and for the living world, because there's less programmed obsolescence, less manufactured products to make, and less detergent and less water. This is the kind of model we have to be capable of developing. And I think this vision of value centered on this alignment between the stakeholders based on a common interest is the key. At the Circle of these Economies, I think we should focus on working on this idea of value. This is very important. I don't think we'll be able to find a solution unless we have a method based on action. We've always been very concerned that we talk a lot about the subjects of the cross, and about what, and we don't know about how. We've written a book about this idea of how. There are three models. Is the positive business map. The first thing is that find out how. You have to have a governance model. How do we carry out governance of businesses? The reasons to be together, systematic work on the stakeholders and the ecosystems, and the decision-making systems to be able to work with these people. The second point is to deliberately look at our business models. We were saying earlier, to scale up, we have to have CSR at the heart of the business strategy and businesses. We have to reinvent these business models. This is what I was saying about value. In this respect, I recommend you look at companies like CTO or the Compagnie Nationale de Rhône to see at how they are capable of looking at things in terms of an ecosystem without losing their role as an energy supplier. It's necessary to rethink the energy models, the value models. The other thing is the culture of leaders and the culture of employees. For Renault, we're working on training 180 employees to become aware of environmental issues and to enable them to switch over so that this has an impact on the business strategy, that they're capable of changing their business model. By changing to action, you rethink business governance, you deliberately change the business models, and you transform the cultural models. At IKEA, we are optimists by nature, and if we rethink values together and every company has its own method for action, we'll be able to succeed. You know that people say optimism is determination and pessimism is reason. There's some interesting examples you've given, where we can see that examples of transformation and scaling up. We can see that CSR can completely change a company, including the employees. You were talking about training, which is an important aspect. A lot of companies today are training their employees in CSR. So there's a collective thing at stake here. Not talking about a cherry on the cake and the compliance with standards and rather dusty concepts, which is really something that's completely transformative at every level of the company. This is an interesting message. Just one more thing. Human nature is not destructive. If you look at human nature and you can get humans to be capable of, be aware of the issues, then you can get them to transform themselves. We now move on to Adi Medeb. We're moving over to the other side of the Mediterranean. It's also very valuable to hear you. There have been a lot of questions already on the website about this international dimension. How can we act in France and in Europe? Europe wants to be a pioneer in decarbonization, but we forget that we have relations with the South, which are very important, and there will also be effects. We're in the same overall economic system, so there will inevitably be impacts. We're interested to see how you approach this question. You're promoting the change in business models and cultural models. Let me repeat what Arnaud Cangloff said just now. You emphasize the cultural aspect of CSR. Yes, thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you today and to contribute a certain enlightenment and from the South in these forums where everything is very French and very European, but the international dimension, it seems to me, is not fully present. So I'd like to bring the point of view from the South and the experience of Tunisia, where I live and work. CSR, over the last few years, is being seen as a way of providing a solution or several solutions to global problems. I think the recent crises, whether it's COVID-19 or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, have generated global problems and have made clear the need to find global solutions to these global problems. CSR, from that point of view, can be seen as a way of getting companies to behave in a more virtuous way and a more responsible way. However, on that basis, this means we're talking about a transformation of cultural behavior of companies. Cultural transformation cannot be imposed and cannot be carried out in the short term. It's a long-term task, and it requires the deployment of several concomitant types of action. It cannot be imposed. It's not because you have a law that says all companies have to adhere to CSR, as was been the case in Tunisia in 2018. For example, in June 2018, the Tunisian government ratified a law on CSR. 5 years later, this text has not been implemented because the decrees to implement the law have never been put in place and probably never will be. This text corresponded to, at a particular time, to a political desire to give a strong signal to areas of activity where the local population no longer accepted the irresponsible behaviors of certain companies in extractive industries, whether it's phosphates or hydrocarbons, and saying to them, nothing has been done correctly so far. You'll see with this law, everything will be much better from now on. But in fact, this law represents, highlights a double risk that threatens CSR. The first risk is an administrative risk. In other words, people use CSR in the administrative and political sphere, and they don't sufficiently integrate companies and economic stakeholders in the appropriation of the CSR. Nothing will be done in that case. The second risk is that we want to force companies to integrate additional costs associated with CSR that they are not ready to assume, and so nothing happens then either. I was saying that CSR is a cultural transformation, requires a cultural transformation. For me, there are 5 aspects to this. First aspect is education. It's true that it's urgent to carry this cultural transformation today, but if we don't take account of the methods for deploying this cultural transformation, it'll just be wishful thinking. So the first aspect is education. From the youngest age, children have to understand the behavioral aspects and as a responsible adults in a company. The second aspect is information. The third aspect is incentives. We have to be exemplary. There has to be a leadership in the company which is exemplary and shows the way. The fourth aspect is correction. A fifth aspect is positive sanctions and negative sanctions afterwards. Positive sanctions means that we positively reward companies that are taking the right path. I'd like to end by taking an example in Tunisia of what we could have done if we had adopted a true CSR approach over the last few years. We're talking about a major economic crisis in Tunisia, and this is the case. We often talk about the failure of two sectors, phosphates and hydrocarbons. For example, in phosphates, we produced 8 million tons in 2010. We're moving to 115 million tons today. We are producing 3 million tons because populations are not ready to integrate this production. They're doing everything they can to stop this production. The second sector is hydrocarbons. We're producing 100,000 barrels a day. Today, we're producing 35,000 barrels per day. Again, there's a lot of protest by the local people. If the approach had been true CSR, with a sense of responsibility, where the negotiations would have taken place in transparency, with credibility, and then this would have led to appropriation of the solutions by the local communities and active and economic players, it would have worked. I'd like to end by saying the CSR is faced by global problems. The South has been mentioned earlier. It is faced with global problems, and we need to have global solutions to solve these global problems, and this requires global solidarity, which today is not sufficiently present. Thank you very much.
Merci, on voit bien, on vous est...
Thank you very much. By listening to you, all of you, we realize how it is a systemic topic. There's not on one side companies and on the other side culture, society, and information. This is a topic that I'd like to react to, but if there are questions in the room, please raise your hand and prepare your question. And in the meantime, I will read a question that was sent online. Several questions are on standards. Each of us understands very well that standards are a factor of acceleration because at some point it encourages the industrials to invest in a particular technology. And at the same time, several people who follow us tell us, are the standards, isn't there a risk for French companies if, for example, we have very strict rules to develop electrical vehicle? Don't we open the door to the Chinese cars, for example? This is the type of dilemma that you brought up earlier on, Thierry. We think a lot about dilemmas. It creates a lot of dilemmas. So this question of standards is very important. It's a bit confused. Some people are asking in terms of financial markets or European rules. Is it an accelerator or doesn't it put our companies at risk? Which one of you would like to answer this question on standards? Axel? No, I'm not going to answer directly on standards. I have a triple conviction on transformation, and I don't think that standards are the right answer. I don't believe in the fact that our Western societies are declining. I don't think we're ready to give up the standards of living that we have. It is true in Europe. It is even more true in the US. We are used to a level of living standards that we don't want to give up. And the southern countries, it's a different story. Some African states, an African statesman said that the population was growing and that the production of the milk was reducing. So how can we help people who are in underserved neighborhoods? So standards are a good thing, but if there's no concrete solution, we're going to create revolution. Second thing is I believe that the market economy and what works the best in the market economy is how we regulate this transition with price. This is a very political topic. And third, it's investment. How do we develop investment policies that are massive enough with a high level of risk to encourage those transitions? I would like to shed a light on standards. Standards are necessary, but unfortunately, they're not enough. The reality is we need standards, but we know that every collective system, we need to regulate and apply standards. If your idea is to be systemic, it has to be ecosystemic, because the value of tomorrow is not measured with the result of each company. That's why we work on the development of networks if we want to get somewhere. In every ecosystem, we know it well, the dilemma of the prisoner is here to remind us of it. It's a cooperation. Cooperation is not based on standards. Cooperation is based on cooperation agreements and new forms of contracts. So we need to use standards for what it's worth, which is to set a number of rules of the game and then trust the entrepreneurs who can cooperate, who can work together. We need to give them enough leeway to work together in a dynamic of cooperation. Axel Lemaire, and then we'll take a couple of questions from in the room. I see a few hands raised. We'll take 3 questions at the same time. I say that for the person who's holding out the mic. This question of standards is fundamental. In the US, we see a lot of companies that are rebelling against what they live as constraints, environmental and social constraints imposed by their investors, who nowadays are asking them to show the positive impact that they have in these fields, and they rebel against it by saying we're here to make profits and that's it. At the same time that some European companies can say, yes, but it is quite unfair because when we're in China, for example, our competitors are not bound to the same regulations and standards. So I'm just going to express my personal opinion, but I am glad to see that we're not using this argument where we're trying to put an end to child labor, for example. I keep believing in a form of universal rules, and Europe is the most advanced continent in the definition of those types of rules with the taxonomy, the European taxonomy. And I think it is a conflict or the expression of European values within those standards. I give you a very concrete example. An international company has a problem with rules in terms of disabled people, because in France, they are obliged to show that they conduct some actions to integrate some people who are in a situation of disablement, versus in the US, they have to be careful not to point out disabled people. So for the people who are from ethnic background, it is different. In France, we should not take account of these people. Versus in the US, we need to count the number of people from different ethnic backgrounds in their employees to make sure that they achieve their goals of diversity. The GDPR, to protect the private data and public freedoms. When I talk about this, people told me, "Oh, no more standards, more standards." So this is a tool of soft law to protect personal data. 3 questions in the room. Thank you. Please, hello. I'm going to try to be quick. Mr. Martel, you asked a question about your legitimacy between the milk of the cows or the children. The CNRS has created its own deontology committee for companies to know how to ask ourselves the right question from a scientific point of view. Another question. We're going to take 3 questions. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for this intervention. I'd like to add something to the previous questions, and I'm even going to bring an answer to it. The people who are wondering about their legitimacy to make a choice, I believe that there are a lot of citizens' movements and consumers' movement that go up to companies that embody these commitments, and that can be done particularly on the choice of insurance. The question I wanted to ask, because there's several of you that have brought up this topic of changing of scale and getting into action, I'd like to go back on the territorial dimension and local dimension. How can we do when we're a very small company and when we're not subject to these standards to have commitments with actors on our territory? What kinds of solution do you imagine for those small companies? Another question? And then we'll listen to the lady behind. So you, as an introduction, you identified CSR, and the definition that you chose is the definition of societal and environmental responsibility. In societal, the 16th commitment of the SDGs, which is to promote a peaceful society. When I say a peaceful society, if you look at the current context, which is not really peaceful. So how companies today contribute to promote the state that cannot do everything on its own, how the public sector can help when we're in a context of CSR. That's a lot of responsibility. I have a question for Mr. Martel. We talk about CSR. CSR is the contribution to the 3 pillars of sustainable development. There's an economic pillar as well, so the company has to remain economically sustainable. As an insurer, I wanted to ask you the question, how do you position yourself with the climate change, the number of risks that are growing and the number of damage? How are you going to keep paying reparation to your clients from disaster linked to climate change? And how do you manage your CSR approach to protect your clients from all those disasters? Monsieur Martel will start. Thierry Martel will start. I'm going to answer on the ethics committee. It exists, and this is a risk for democracy. You see that Zuckerberg has his own ethics committee, and he decides who speaks and who doesn't speak, what's going on or what's not going on, and he decides to cut the account of a political person. I think it's the democracy that is in danger. And to ask companies to have ethics committee because the state is not fully playing its part is a whole topic in itself. And I believe if companies go too far on the field of democracy, it's the foundation of our democracy that are at risk. On the question of climate risk, you are right to mention it. I'm going to give you an idea. In France, we talk a lot about 3 million houses that are being threatened by damage. To do the prevention for a house is 15K. That represents 45 billion. We don't get 45 billion. So we're facing some huge financing issues, major financing requests, demands. Maybe, Axel, you want to say something on the territorial dimension? I would like to go back on standards to say that for a century and a half, the Western world or the Northern Hemisphere polluted happily and immensely. For the last 30 years, we tell the South, it's a global problem, we have to pollute each other. I understand and I fully adhere to this approach, but it's difficult to admit it. And that sends us back to the global governance of the world that challenges the international institutions and their functioning. And it is not because there are going to be some large gatherings in Paris or elsewhere that are going to change the way things go. We need cooperation, but we need cooperation that is not only territorial. We need trans-border cooperation and decentralized cooperation, because the issues that are dealt by CSR ignore the limits, the boundaries, and if we don't have global solidarity, we won't go very far. Axel Lemaire, you have the last word to conclude. I so agree with what you just said. in reality, the real problem is, aren't there too many standards for European companies, but how can we together address the real challenges that are global and will manage to help developing countries to one day being able to, as well, being capable to respect those standards. It's like, taxes. And we'd like for everyone to be paying too much taxes one day. This is a joke. So, on the local dimension, I believe that it is probably the best one for action. And I said when I was a member of a national movement, the state is here to give a framework, but action starts on the ground. And I worked for the biggest association in France. And the association knew how to loan money with the pro bono factors and donors systems in the company. So maybe the very small company to turn to those funding processes. But what is still difficult in the triptych association, public powers and companies is to develop projects together, is to create solutions together to address challenges that are very concrete. And concretely, it implies finding some time and to be able to hand an assignment to a team member to tell him that as part of his time, he's going to be working on that for the full-time employees. So full-time employees would be working on those solutions, and not just to mitigate the risks and the adverse impact of climate change, for example. That's where we go from CSR to the SDGs. Marie-Françoise, to wrap up, I would like to say that CSR is a reality in science, is a reality in the conscience. So it's a utopia that we need to follow up on and to keep pursuing. Thank you very much.